Hello, everyone, and welcome to the HR Break Room, Paycom's podcast dedicated to conversations on the hot topics in HR. I'm your host, Morgan Beard, and today's episode is big time. We'll be talking to best-selling author, award-winning actor, philanthropist, and humanitarian Hill Harper about the importance of the Juneteenth holiday, how companies can prioritize workplace diversity, and how to truly be an advocate of equity and inclusion in the workplace. But before we bring in Hill and dive into this important conversation, let's review a quick history of Juneteenth. On Sunday, June 19th, the U.S. observed Juneteenth, now a federal holiday more than 150 years in the making. In January of 1863, Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, giving freedom to people in slavery. But 250,000 enslaved people in the Confederate state of Texas did not immediately get released from their owners. They continued to be forced to work in the conditions they knew until June 19, 1865, when 2,000 Union troops delivered a decree from Union Major General Gordon Granger. That decree informing the people of Texas that the slaves were free. June 19th becoming a day of celebration after that, which spread to Oklahoma and Texas and other neighboring states. The day now known as Juneteenth is also known as Freedom Day or Jubilee Day. And with that history lesson, let's now dive into the HR Break Room. Hill Harper now here inside the HR Break Room. Hill, first of all, I just got to say, sincerely appreciate the time. Thank you for stopping by here today. How have you been? Long time no see.
Yeah, listen, it's good to be back in the HR Break Room. I'm excited for our discussion and just happy. I think that been very impressed by all the interactions I've had with everybody at Paycom, having visited the campus there last year. And so I'm excited to continue the conversation that we started then.
Yeah, and we're excited to have you and continue it as well. And of course, a big topic of conversation back then, Juneteenth, we're coming off the heels of it here as we talk to you. And I'll start kind of giving you the floor. Juneteenth has been a big topic of discussion. So for you, just personally, what does Juneteenth mean to you as we get the conversation started there?
Well, for me, I think Juneteenth is one of the most important American holidays we have. And it's not just a holiday. And this is really important. I want folks to understand this. I hear people talking about this a lot. They talk about it as if it's a holiday for Black America or Black Americans or African Americans. It's not that. It's not. It's a great American holiday. Why? Because to me, it celebrates three distinct things. But most importantly, it celebrates freedom. And to me, if we talk about what makes America great, the greatest country in the world, and what makes us great, democracy and freedom, those two things, and they're inextricably linked. And so to me, when we talk about what Juneteenth represents, it represents democracy and ultimately freedom. And we can get into it and break down more aspects of what Juneteenth is and what it means to me. One, it speaks to truth. It speaks to social justice. It also speaks to fundamentally celebration, celebrating freedom. And I'm happy to dig deeper into that. But to all the folks who were celebrating Juneteenth and all of that when this summer and we look to the future, I love that holiday. I love it. And I think it's great. And it's a great American holiday for everybody.
Yeah, absolutely. And a big part of this, I think, is awareness of Juneteenth has been growing. I mean, we've got some numbers right here. 41% of American workers knew about Juneteenth prior to 2020. Then after the national protest we saw a couple years ago, that in conjunction with the Tulsa Race Massacre Centennial, that percentage jumped up to 71% as of May 2021. And then, of course, as you're well aware, President Biden then designating this the 11th federally recognized holiday that year as well. So while encouraging and all that's good and well, I guess what needs to be done in promoting Juneteenth and getting even more national awareness, and how do we as individuals kind of keep the momentum going in this regard?
Well, I think that, like I said, if we think about any holiday, we have to think about what its history is and tell the truth about what its history is. And then think about how do you most honor and celebrate that truth? And I think in this case, when we talk about Juneteenth, we're talking about a holiday that represents folks gaining their freedom and the sacrifices that they and their ancestors had made for 400, 500 plus years of being in bondage leading up until June 19th, 1865. Because importantly, Juneteenth is not a celebration of the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation, which happened in 1863. It's not a celebration of the ratification of the 13th Amendment abolishing slavery in the United States Constitution, which happened later in 1865. What it is folks demanding and fighting for justice and information being delivered and organizing slaves that were being held still and used still as slaves, even though they should have been released when the Emancipation Proclamation was signed in 1863. And so what does that mean? What does it mean? It means that folks were being activists to help people who are marginalized. And I think that's the bigger message here. For me, this holiday is an active holiday, a holiday of service. And if we can make it about that, it's not saying that you can't rest, because holidays are great for rest, but it's also a holiday where you serve. And I think that you focus on what's in your heart and who you like to serve, but focusing on marginalized communities, folks that have gone through struggle, that may not have agency as far as their voice and their activity, that may have experienced economic setback and struggle, may have experienced some type of healthcare struggle or mental health struggle or some type of trauma or generational trauma, or come from a neighborhood or an area or a community that is historically marginalized and underrepresented. And so when we think about it in those terms, when we think about how can I help or serve, then you can show up and use the idea of a Juneteenth holiday and that type of holiday as an active holiday of service. And that's what I think makes this holiday a great American holiday.
Yeah, and you're taking this exactly where I want it to go. You've said before, it's more than just the day of celebration. It's more than just a holiday. It should be more than that all year round. How do we keep that going? Simple question, but a complex answer.
Sure. So here's the deal. To me, the number one way to keep it going is you first have to ask yourself. We have to ask ourselves the question, what makes my heart beat faster when I think of something that's not just, it's not right? And then whatever that is, you decide, okay, I think I want to lean into disparities in public education, because education and educational disparities and reading gaps and education gaps make my heart beat faster. Oh, no, I care about protecting women against violence and domestic abuse and things like that. And so I want to lean into that issue. Or no, I care about the racial wealth gap. And I want to, that makes my heart beat faster. I know that and that's for me. I always say you can't have social justice without economic justice. So one of the areas where I completely makes my heart beat faster and I lean into is the wealth gap. And so there are many different areas that folks can do. But for me, when I think about Juneteenth, I think that of being pro-equity and being anti-racist. Pro-equity means I want to create freedom and opportunity for other folks that have otherwise been marginalized. So what is that, in the bigger context, tell people the truth that they're no longer in bondage, pro-equity, and then be anti-racist, meaning I'm going to fight against systemic racism, microaggression, covert racism, and overt racism.
So what do you think has been working in making this a part of the dialogue, a part of our everyday actions? Examples like that and so many other ones I'm sure you could talk about. What's been working in that regard to keep that dialogue up more than just the one day a year? And how do we keep that going?
I think what's been working is the idea that folks are realizing that there are a myriad of mechanisms for basically changing history that exists now, right? In other words, there are all these tools to disseminate information, and there's very little check on any of the information that's disseminated. So therefore, you can actually influence people's thoughts and behaviors and convince them of something that may not even be true. That's why all of us have to work more vigilantly to identify what is fake and not true, and also expand our circles of who we communicate with. Because particularly in social media, particularly that's what I love, what you're doing at the HR Break Room, inviting me in. I'm a voice that's not necessarily the same voice that folks may hear at Paycom all the time. But at the same time, I have my own set of thoughts and opinions, and I respect and want to hear thoughts and opinions from other people that may not share the same history as me or have learned the same things I've learned. So therefore, I can learn from them, they can learn from me, and we can have a sharing. Unfortunately, in today's world of social media, most of us live in very tight silos. And so what happens is we tend to exchange the same ideas and information within the same circles. And even if the information isn't actually correct, somehow we convince ourselves that it is, because there are other people within our tight circle that believe it is, and we start reinforcing that. That's why it's so important to actively step outside and be willing to hear and learn from other folks. Follow people that don't necessarily agree with you or you agree with. Understand their point of view and perspective. And that way it's very important, because we're in a time where folks are trying to even influence and impact what's taught in schools when it comes to history in this country and history around the world. And that's where it starts getting extremely, extremely dangerous. I mean, I was shocked when I was in Oklahoma last year to hear that there were a number of people that actually grew up in Oklahoma that were never taught about the Tulsa Race Massacre. And so that's something that was specific, that was nationwide in news, but happened in Oklahoma, happened 100 years ago, but groups of people who were controlling what was taught in schools decided that shouldn't be taught. Now, we have to talk about that, just like we have to talk about all these things that are very, very, very uncomfortable to talk about, because if we don't talk about them, how can we actually have some reconciliation and move forward for some healing? Because ultimately it's about healing in the future and moving forward in a positive direction. And unless you actually reconcile and deal with the history, it's very difficult to move forward. Dr. King has a quote that I talk about all the time, and I truly believe this, where Dr. King said, "We are all tied together in a single garment of mutual destiny." He didn't say some folks are tied together. He didn't say Black folks are tied together. He said we are all tied together in a single garment of mutual destiny. And I truly believe that. We're all inextricably linked. And until we actually understand what that means and respect our differences and respect our pluralism, but at the same time see our commonality and see that if I can expand opportunity for any group, I'm expanding it for every group, there are wins in working together. And there are wins in celebrating diversity and inclusion. There are wins in celebrating diverse voices. There are wins in being pro-equity and anti-racist. All of these things are positive wins for everybody, not just certain groups. And vitriol and separation and hatred have no place in a country that where we've been through so much struggle to get to where we are, and it leads with democracy and freedom.
Yeah, and you mentioned diversity and inclusion there as we kind of segue into the workplace. Now we could take everything you're saying and put it into the workplace. And using Juneteenth as an example, they could use that as a part of a company's broader diversity, equity, inclusion programs to basically broaden those values, as you mentioned. How can that serve to strengthen its commitment to those values, using Juneteenth maybe as the epicenter for that change?
I think that if you think about, again, the idea of Juneteenth being a holiday of service as well as celebration, that I want my workplace to be that too, right? I want my workplace to be a place where I can feel respected and that I feel valued and I feel celebrated, right? But at the same time, I'm serving, I'm doing great work.
You've talked to Paycom before, and I think you said back then was a bottom-to-top approach is what companies should use as opposed to top-to-bottom. Essentially that an organization is judged by how the most vulnerable person is or how they're accepted or how their mindset is, kind of what you were just talking about there. Can you elaborate more on that and how it relates to diversity and inclusion in the workplace?
Most of this ingenuity and is happening from the perspective of the bottom up, the person who is actively writing the code, the person who's actually helping that person who's creating and launching code and doing code review, the person who's actually communicating directly with customers through customer service. I call mine the customer success team or customer success department. The folks that are actually keeping the facility safe and clean and keeping it a place where you want to work, right? Keeping it a place that makes you feel creative. The folks that are cooking the food that you eat at lunch, that make you, that hopefully keeps you healthy and vibrant to be able to come up with ideas. We're all in this together, and everybody serves an extremely important role all the way through the ecosystem. But if we focus on the folks that are so-called at the bottom of the org chart, and we basically say, what ideas do you have? How do you want to add? How can we include you in this entire vertical that is our org? Then all of a sudden, you are, I think, lifting, the people used to say, lift yourself up from the bootstraps. You're actually lifting the organization up because everybody on each level feels simultaneously encouraged and elevated, but at the same time challenged in a way to say, hey, if they're listening to ideas from this person who is, in my mind, below me on the org chart, then certainly they're listening to my ideas as well. And it creates wonderful opportunity. And it creates, and I believe you end up fast forwarding years later, you see people who otherwise may have been stuck in some type of position, rising to positions of real authority and influence within an organization, or maybe even in another organization, because they were set up to succeed even somewhere else. And then they end up being a great client of Paycom, right? And so that type of work, that type of respect for everybody, and that type of work to include everyone's voices and make them feel heard, I think is great work. And I think that Paycom, you guys are, from what I saw, do a lot of that, even through this conversation. It's called the HR break room, which is awesome, right? It's like, hey, everybody can go to the break room, right? Everybody can, and everybody's welcome. This didn't say the VIP break room, right? And so everybody's welcome in the HR break.
Tying everything together, part of the greater DEI efforts, you talk about building from the ground up. A lot of that is education, right? So what can an organization do? Some concrete examples, in your opinion, to educate its workforce. What do you recommend as a starting point for an organization to get its people educated so they can, as you've been talking about, build from the ground up?
I think leader-led breakouts that are encouraged, that are basically saying, hey, these are important to us. Obviously, within an organization, you can always tell if something is important fundamentally to the organization. I'll tell you one way I tell a lot when this is obviously pre-pandemic, when we do these in-person talks, and you go to a site or a facility, and they invite you there and they say, this is the most important event or talk we believe of the year. Maybe it's a race-based discussion, and then none of the ultra senior leadership is even there, right? And that sends a message to the organization that you can give lip service that something's important, but unless the senior leadership actually is there. So when the CEO and chairman or chairman shows up for something, it's important.
Yeah.
When the chief innovation officer or anyone from the C-suite shows up, something's important. When those folks aren't there, and it's on campus, you get it while folks aren't there if it's somewhere else or on a Zoom or whatever. But when it's on campus and they're not there, you're like, whoa, what are they doing if this is the most important thing of the year? And so to me, showing up and not just giving lip service to something, and that's from the leadership on down, is important. And giving people space to talk through things and share ideas, whiteboarding stuff out where you write things up and write things down and write ideas down. All of that, it matters. All of that's important, but it really has to start from the leadership first, because if there's any hint or whiff that discussing these issues and actually creating solutions around really sticky diversity and inclusion issues aren't something that matters, then it'll all be lip service and really the meter won't move at all.
And you mentioned, I mean, these are uncomfortable conversations to have. So how do you get leaders to break through and just have these uncomfortable conversations, kind of break through that discomfort? Is that something that you can promote or try to change, or is that something that's going to take years? How do we kind of break through that to get leaders involved in these meetings?
I think that you have to bring in outside voices to help, and that's in part why, like, you invite somebody like me in, because we can actually help facilitate a conversation that someone else, quite frankly, may not feel comfortable facilitating. We can bring up things that they may not feel comfortable saying, but have to be said. And then it allows at the same time people who either want to say them, they're like, he said exactly what I've been wanting to say, or folks that have wanted to try to get someone to either say it or have never heard it, say, wow, I've never thought of it that way. No one's ever said this to me. How come no one's ever brought this up? And so we need to do that work and put real resources to bear to do it. And again, that goes back to time, resources, and prioritization. Those things are all critical pieces to the diversity, inclusion, access, opportunity pieces that I talk about all the time. And too often, folks can get siloed in the D&I space and just, oh, that's that person who does that work. Well, really what it should be is you're hoping, I hate to say this, you hope that you can put yourself out of business. You hope that, my father was a psychiatrist, and he always used to say to me, I hope I'm good enough at my job that I literally don't have a job someday because all my patients don't need me anymore. Yeah. And the hope is that we push to a place where everything that we want to teach around DE&I and is so ubiquitous and is such part of the fabric of the organization that actual role morphs into something else, because the need for that role actually expands into maybe just a facilitation of these amazing things and programs that are happening that are just a part of the culture already. And to me, that's very unique, and it's very hard to achieve, but it's there. And at least that can be part of our blueprint and saying, we're going to get there. We don't know when and how. We're going to get there.
It's not really just about diversity. I mean, the other two letters, the other two words, inclusion and equity has to be equal, and you include people as well, not just be diverse for the sake of being diverse.
Yes. And equity often, I know, can be a firebrand word for people. Mm-hmm. And, there's that wonderful picture that maybe you guys could pull it up. I don't have it with me, but there's a wonderful picture of there's a wall, and folks are trying to look over the wall, and there are different heights of boxes. And then you say, well, what does equity ultimately look like? Equity ultimately is the removal of the wall altogether, right? So everyone has an opportunity to view things in a similar and same way. But at the end of the day, opportunity and access are part of that, right? And you get to that if you provide opportunity and access. And so I love the idea of, it's not about trying to just create so-called equal outcomes. It's about providing opportunity and access. And that helps everybody. And that has to be part of the discussion. People coming and bringing their own unique experiences to the table, to that room where it happens, helps everybody, including the organization and including the bottom line of the organization. Because oftentimes people say, well, at the end of the day, a for-profit company, there's a fiduciary responsibility to the stockholders, and that's where the buck stops. And the beautiful thing about that conversation is that it is quantifiable and justifiable, and it can be shown time and time again that when you do really great DE&I work on all three of those pieces, you actually help the bottom line. So you're actually serving that bigger mission for a for-profit publicly traded company to have to be serving the shareholders by actually being extremely robust in terms of your diversity, your equity, and your inclusion.
And I feel like we've talked about so much, but of course, we're just scratching the surface with this kind of conversation. We could keep you here all day long if you have the time, and I know you're a busy man. But before we do wrap up this great conversation that we have had, final thoughts, put a bow on it. What is something maybe that we didn't touch on that is really important to you that you just want to get out there when it comes to Juneteenth, DEI, anything regarding what we talked about today? What would you kind of put your final stamp on? What would you have to say?
I would say another I word that we haven't gotten into that much, and that's innovation. Technology allows us the opportunity to really take on a lot of these issues. Obviously, we want to use data and we want it to be data driven, but using and actively using technology and all that technology offers helps us be more inclusive. It helps to solve some real systemic problems. For many groups that have been discriminated against, something that's just fair is actually revolutionary. And that's when we look at blockchain technology, we look at other types of tech platforms that are agnostic in many ways to race, but create equity and outcomes with its use, then we actually will see positive things happen around the systemic nature of racist things. Now, here's the problem, and this is, I would be remiss if I didn't point this out. You can bake in bias into algorithms. So technology isn't just a panacea. I've recently worked with some of the bigger credit rating agencies that brought me in to sort of help them with some of the algorithmic problems or biases that are baked into credit ratings and how that works and what we can do to actually solve some of those problems. So that's why, again, we go back to the engineers you hire, the people who are writing the code. If you don't have some measure of diversity there, then you can end up baking in bias into the actual tech that otherwise would be completely agnostic and fair. And so we have to understand that having diverse groups of engineers, code review people, the idea of using DE&I aspects, even applying it in tech that we launch in a tech company is important, right? So all of those things are critical. And I'm glad we got to talk about that, because that obviously Paycom is a tech company, and knowing that it's so important to have, if there's not a pipeline of great diverse engineers, then let's figure out how to create a pipeline. Let's go to some of the HBCUs and other places and have fund seats for developing engineers to create a pipeline. All of these things we may have to do. We may have to create a farm system, but knowing it's important and then having that blueprint in place and then developing that foundation, again, creates a pipeline of diversity even within the engineering space.
And like you said, to tie that all up, DEI and I, you got to get that extra I in there as well. Hill, thank you so much for joining HR Break Room today. We really enjoyed having you for this important conversation. And of course, as always, thank you listeners for tuning into our conversation today as well. And remember, you can keep up with every episode of HR Break Room by following or subscribing on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or searching wherever your podcasts are found. To find more episodes of our podcast covering the latest trends in HR and HR technology, head on over to our website, hrbreakroom.com, or follow us on social media. Find us on Facebook at facebook.com/Paycom, on Twitter @Paycom, or on Instagram @Paycom Software. Thank you for tuning in to today's episode, and we can't wait to join you again when we return to the HR Break Room.